The morning sun cast long shadows across Miller's diner as Thomas Henderson adjusted his worn World War II veteran cap in his usual corner booth. At 93, his weathered hands still steadily gripped his coffee mug, a daily ritual he'd maintained for the past 15 years in this small Montana town. Sarah, the middle-aged waitress who had served him breakfast every morning since her first day, approached with a fresh pot of coffee. "The usual, Mr. Henderson?" she asked, already knowing his order of scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and extra crispy bacon would follow. Thomas nodded, his blue eyes twinkling beneath his bushy white eyebrows. The diner was quiet at this early hour, just as he preferred it. The gentle hum of the ceiling fans and occasional clink of dishes from the kitchen created a peaceful atmosphere that reminded him of simpler times. As Sarah returned to the kitchen, the bell above the door chimed. Thomas glanced up to see a group of leather-clad bikers entering the establishment. Their boots thundered against the checkered floor as they made their way inside, the smell of cigarettes and motor oil following in their wake. The group, consisting of 6 men ranging from their late 20s to early 40s, commanded attention with their presence. Their leather vests displayed patches Thomas couldn't quite make out, but their demeanor suggested they weren't part of any legitimate motorcycle club he knew of. The leader, a tall man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, scanned the diner before his eyes landed on Thomas. A smirk crossed his face as he nudged one of his companions, pointing at the veteran's cap perched atop Thomas's head. Well, what do we have here?" the leader announced loudly, making his way toward Thomas's booth. "Looks like we found ourselves a relic from the past." His companions chuckled, spreading out to occupy the surrounding booths. Thomas maintained his composure, taking another sip of his coffee. He'd faced worse in his lifetime, much worse. The young man's attempt at intimidation barely registered compared to the memories of war that still visited him in his dreams. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, her face tensing at the sight of the bikers. She hurried to Thomas's table with his breakfast, placing it carefully before him. "Everything okay here, Mr. Henderson?" she asked, shooting a warning glance at the bikers. "Just fine, Sarah," Thomas replied calmly, picking up his fork. "Though our new friends might want to know this is a respectable establishment." His voice, though aged, carried the weight of authority that came from years of command. The leader's smirk faltered slightly at Thomas's composed response, but he quickly recovered. "Respectable, huh?" he sneered, leaning closer to Thomas's table. "Just like those fancy medals you old-timers love to wear? Tell me, old man, what war stories you got to share?" Thomas methodically buttered his toast, seemingly unaffected by the man's proximity. "Son, there are stories better left untold," he replied, his tone carrying a hint of warning that made Sarah pause as she walked past. The other patrons in the diner had grown quiet, watching the scene unfold. Most were locals who knew Thomas as the quiet veteran who attended every Memorial Day service, who volunteered at the VFW, and who never spoke about his time in the service unless asked directly by another veteran. What these bikers couldn't see was the slight tensing of Thomas's shoulders, a reflexive response honed from years of military service. They couldn't know about the classified operations he'd led, the lives he'd saved, or the network of connections he still maintained within the highest ranks of military command. The leader opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the arrival of his group's breakfast orders. As they moved to their own tables, they continued to cast glances in Thomas's direction, whispering and laughing among themselves. Thomas finished his breakfast in silence, leaving his usual generous tip for Sarah. As he stood to leave, the leader called out, "See you tomorrow, old-timer." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Thomas paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle. Without turning around, he straightened his back, his posture shifting subtly to reveal a glimpse of the soldier he'd once been. The diner fell silent as he spoke. "Yes, son, I expect you will." With that, he pushed open the door and stepped out into the Montana morning, leaving behind a tension that would soon explode into something none of the bikers could have anticipated. Over the next 3 weeks, Miller's Diner became a battleground of civil warfare. The bikers, led by their snake-tattooed leader who locals now knew as Rex, made it their personal mission to torment Thomas Henderson every morning. They arrived earlier each day, deliberately occupying Thomas's corner booth before he could reach it. The veteran was forced to sit at the counter or at smaller tables near the kitchen, away from his preferred spot by the window where he could watch the sunrise paint colors across the Montana sky. Sarah witnessed their cruelty with growing concern. One morning, as she served Thomas his usual breakfast at the counter, Rex deliberately bumped into her, causing hot coffee to splash across Thomas's veteran cap. The old soldier removed his cap slowly, wiping it clean with a napkin while the bikers snickered. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Henderson," Sarah whispered, her hands shaking with anger as she cleaned up the mess. Thomas just smiled gently and patted her hand. "Spilled coffee never killed anyone, Sarah," he said, but his eyes held a distant look, one she'd seen before when he occasionally spoke of his war days. The harassment escalated gradually. The bikers would rev their motorcycles loudly whenever Thomas walked past them in the parking lot. They began spreading rumors around town that his war stories were fake, that he was just an old man seeking attention. Some of the younger residents, not knowing Thomas's history in the community, started to believe them. One particularly tense morning, Rex approached Thomas at the counter, holding a smartphone. "Hey, war hero," he sneered, showing Thomas a webpage about stolen valor. "Been doing some reading about fake veterans. Makes you think, doesn't it?" Thomas continued eating his eggs, seemingly unaffected. But Sarah noticed his hand gripping the fork slightly tighter, his knuckles turning white for just a moment. The local sheriff, Bill Martinez, started making more frequent stops at the diner. He'd known Thomas for 20 years and could sense the building tension. "I can run them in for harassment, Tom," he offered one morning, watching the bikers through narrowed eyes. Thomas shook his head. "Not necessary, Bill. Some battles need to be fought differently." The sheriff didn't know that Thomas had already begun making phone calls in the evenings, reaching out to old contacts he hadn't spoken to in years. The situation reached a new level when the bikers discovered Thomas's daily routine of visiting the local VFW hall after breakfast. They began following him there, parking their motorcycles outside, and making crude jokes about the veterans inside. Young veterans who frequented the VFW wanted to confront the bikers, but Thomas always calmed them down. "There's a right way and a wrong way to handle this," he would say, though few understood what he meant. The breaking point came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Thomas arrived at the diner wearing his full set of service medals on his jacket, something he did only on special occasions. It would have been his late wife Margaret's birthday, and he always honored her memory by wearing his medals, as she had been so proud of his service. Rex and his gang were already inside, and their eyes lit up at the sight of the medals. As Thomas made his way to the counter, Rex stepped directly into his path. "Nice jewelry collection, old man," Rex sneered, reaching out to finger one of the medals. "Wonder how much these would fetch online." The diner fell silent. Sarah stopped mid-pour at a nearby table, her coffee pot frozen in midair. Even Rex's fellow bikers seemed to sense this was different from their usual harassment. Thomas stood perfectly still as Rex's fingers touched the Distinguished Service Cross on his chest. His eyes, usually warm and gentle, turned to steel, the same look he'd worn decades ago when making decisions that would save or end lives. Without warning, Rex grabbed the medals, yanking them hard enough to break the pins holding them to Thomas's jacket. The medals clattered to the floor, scattering under tables and chairs. The diner erupted in gasps. Sarah dropped her coffee pot. Sheriff Martinez, who had just pulled into the parking lot for his morning coffee, was already rushing through the door. But Thomas remained calm. He slowly bent down, picked up his Distinguished Service Cross, and placed it in his pocket. Without a word, he walked outside, leaving the rest of his medals on the floor. The bikers laughed triumphantly, thinking they'd finally broken the old man's spirit. They didn't notice Thomas pulling out an ancient flip phone from his jacket pocket. They couldn't hear him dialing a number he hadn't called in years. And they certainly couldn't imagine the storm that was about to break over their heads. What the bikers didn't know about Thomas Henderson would have filled volumes of classified military documents. Behind his gentle demeanor and quiet morning routines lay a history that even the town's oldest residents couldn't have imagined. In his small house on the outskirts of town, Thomas kept a locked steel box in his basement. That evening, after the incident with his medals, he opened it for the first time in 15 years. Inside lay photographs, documents, and a small red book with numbers written in a code only a handful of people alive could still decipher. Thomas's military career hadn't ended with World War II. While most assumed he'd returned home to Montana to farm like many other veterans, he'd actually spent 30 more years working in military intelligence. His expertise in code breaking and strategic operations had made him invaluable during the Cold War. As he sat in his worn leather armchair, looking through old photographs, memories flooded back. There he was, standing beside President Kennedy in an unmarked room beneath the White House. Another photo showed him in Berlin, disguised as a German businessman during a crucial intelligence operation. Each image told a story that had never made it into history books. Sarah, who had driven to his house after her shift to check on him, arrived just as Thomas was replacing the photos in the box. She brought him a slice of apple pie and worried about how he was handling the morning's humiliation. "Mr. Henderson," she said, setting the pie on his coffee table, "Sheriff Martinez wants to press charges about those medals. He's furious about what happened." Thomas smiled, the same calm smile he'd worn during the incident. "No need for that, Sarah. Sometimes the best strategy isn't the most obvious one." He patted the red book beside him. "Did you know I once prevented a major international crisis with just 3 phone calls?" Sarah shook her head, surprised by this unexpected revelation from the usually reserved veteran. "Back in '62, Thomas continued, there was a situation in Cuba. Very few people know how close we came to disaster or how it was really resolved." He paused, looking out his window where the summer sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Sometimes, the quietest solutions are the most effective. What Thomas didn't tell Sarah was that he'd already set things in motion. The numbers in his red book weren't just phone numbers. They were direct lines to people who owed him favors, people who had never forgotten what he'd done for their country. One of those people was General Michael Roberts, now the commander of the Western Division. Another was FBI Special Agent James Cooper, who started his career under Thomas's guidance. The third was Catherine Martinez, no relation to the local sheriff, who now held a senior position in military intelligence. Thomas had spent the afternoon making calls, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had once commanded respect in the highest levels of government. With each call, pieces of a puzzle began falling into place. What emerged was surprising even to Thomas. Rex, whose real name was Richard Keller, wasn't just a troublemaker with a motorcycle. He was a former army sergeant who had gone AWOL 3 years ago after a failed operation in Eastern Europe. 2 other members of his gang were also military deserters, each carrying secrets they thought were well buried. That evening, as Sarah drove home from Thomas's house, she noticed unusual activity at the local airfield. Several black SUVs had arrived, and men in suits were speaking with airport personnel. Military police vehicles were parked discreetly behind the small terminal building. Back in his house, Thomas sat in his chair, the red book open on his lap. He'd made one final call, to a secure line that hadn't been used in over a decade. The response had been immediate. "Consider it handled, sir. We haven't forgotten Berlin." As night fell over the small Montana town, Thomas Henderson prepared for bed with his usual methodical routine. He hung up his jacket, now missing its medals, and placed his veteran's cap on its usual hook. Tomorrow would be an interesting day at Miller's Diner, but he would still arrive at his usual time, order his usual breakfast, and maintain his usual calm demeanor. The only difference would be that tomorrow, justice would finally be served. And it would be served in a way that only a man with Thomas's unique background could arrange, quietly, effectively, and with surgical precision. The next morning dawned with an unusual atmosphere at Miller's Diner. Thomas arrived at his regular time, 7:15 a.m., wearing a plain jacket without medals. The morning air was crisp, and low clouds promised rain later in the day. Rex and his gang were already inside, occupying their usual spots. They looked more agitated than usual, having spent the night discussing strange vehicles they'd noticed around town. 2 of their members, Jake and Marcus, hadn't shown up for breakfast, and their calls went straight to voicemail. Sarah worked quietly, serving coffee with trembling hands. She'd noticed the change in Thomas's demeanor, a subtle shift in his posture, a certain gleam in his eyes that reminded her of a chess player about to reveal a winning move. At 7:45 a.m., the first drops of rain began hitting the diner's windows. Rex was getting increasingly nervous, checking his phone every few minutes. The remaining 3 members of his gang huddled closer, speaking in whispers and casting suspicious glances at the door. Thomas sat at the counter, methodically eating his breakfast as if it were any other morning. The only difference was the ancient flip phone placed next to his coffee cup, its presence like a loaded gun on a carved table. "Hey, old man," Rex called out, his voice carrying a note of desperation rather than its usual mockery. "Missing your precious metals today." His attempt at intimidation fell flat as thunder rolled overhead. Thomas didn't respond. Instead, he checked his watch, a military-issue timepiece that had seen service in 3 different wars. Right on schedule, at exactly 8:00 a.m., the diner's door opened. 2 men in crisp military uniforms entered, followed by 4 MPs in full gear. The military police positioned themselves at strategic points around the diner while the officers approached Rex's table. The other customers fell silent, forks frozen halfway to mouths, coffee cups suspended in midair. "Richard Rex Keller," one officer announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Your unauthorized absence from duty has come to an end." Rex's face drained of color. His remaining gang members looked ready to bolt, but the MPs had already moved to block the exits. Sarah watched from behind the counter, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "This is bull." Rex stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't prove anything." The second officer pulled out a tablet, reading from it with cold precision. "Sergeant Richard Keller, absent without leave since September 15, 2022. Suspected involvement in the unauthorized removal of classified materials from base operations in Eastern Europe. Shall I continue?" Thomas continued eating his breakfast, cutting his toast into precise triangles as the scene unfolded. He didn't react when Rex suddenly pointed at him, face contorted with rage. "You!" Rex shouted. "What did you do? Who are you really?" For the first time that morning, Thomas looked directly at Rex. The old veteran's eyes held 70 years of military service, countless classified operations, and the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down greater threats than an A2O sergeant with a motorcycle. "I tried to tell you, son," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent diner. "Some stories are better left untold." As if on cue, his flip phone buzzed. Thomas answered it with a simple "Yes, sir." After listening for a moment, he handed the phone to the lead officer, who took it with obvious respect. The rain was falling heavily now, drumming against the diner's roof as the MPs began the process of taking Rex and his remaining gang members into custody. Sarah watched in amazement as handcuffs were applied and rights were read. The other customers sat in stunned silence, witnessing what would become a legendary story in their small town. Thomas finished his breakfast, left his usual tip, and stood up slowly. As he passed Rex, who was being led toward the door, the former biker called out one last time. "What about my men? Jake and Marcus?" Thomas paused, adjusting his veteran's cap. "They're already in custody, son. Picked up last night trying to cross the Canadian border." He spoke with the certainty of someone who had orchestrated the entire operation. As Thomas walked to the door, the military officers snapped to attention, saluting him with profound respect. He returned their salutes with practiced precision, then stepped out into the rain, leaving behind a diner full of astonished people who were just beginning to realize that the quiet old veteran they thought they knew had been much more than he seemed. The events at Miller's Diner sparked a chain reaction that rippled through the small Montana town. By noon, military vehicles lined the street, and men in dark suits conducted interviews with witnesses. Local news crews arrived, but were kept at a respectful distance by MPs who had established a perimeter around the area. Inside the diner, now closed to regular customers, Sarah sat at the counter, describing the weeks of harassment to a senior military investigator. Her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee as she recounted each incident in detail. The investigator paid particular attention to the story of the torn medals. In a secure room at the local sheriff's office, Rex and his 2 remaining gang members were being processed. Their tough demeanor had crumbled when confronted with the evidence against them. Files spread across the interview table revealed their involvement in not just going AWOL, but in a complex scheme involving stolen military intelligence. Thomas sat in a different room, surrounded by high-ranking military officials who had flown in from various parts of the country. General Michael Roberts, now gray-haired but still imposing in his full-dress uniform, gripped Thomas's shoulder with genuine affection. "You could have called us sooner, Tom," the general said, shaking his head. "We've been tracking these guys for months. They had access to sensitive information about our Eastern European operations." Thomas sipped from a cup of proper military coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in. "Sometimes you need to let the fish swim a little before you reel them in, Mike." I needed to be sure we had the whole group. FBI Special Agent Cooper, now the head of his division, spread photographs across the table. They showed Jake and Marcus being arrested at the Canadian border, carrying laptops filled with classified documents. Your timing was perfect, sir, Cooper said. They led us right to their contact point. Catherine Martinez, the military intelligence officer, added her own report. We've already recovered most of the stolen files, but sir, I have to ask, how did you know they would make a run for the border last night? Thomas smiled, the same gentle smile he'd worn through weeks of harassment. In my experience, pressure makes people predictable. When Rex started checking his phone every few minutes yesterday, I knew their buyers were getting impatient. The rest was just basic field craft, the kind we used to teach at the farm. The room fell silent as the full scope of Thomas's strategy became clear. He hadn't just been enduring the bikers' harassment. He'd been studying them, watching their patterns, waiting for them to make a mistake. The torn metals had been the final test, proving they were desperate enough to resort to physical confrontation. Meanwhile, back at Miller's diner, Sarah was helping MPs collect security camera footage when she found something interesting. In the corner of one frame, barely visible, was Thomas making a phone call the day before the metals incident. The timestamp matched perfectly with the moment the operation had begun. The local sheriff, Bill Martinez, stood in his office, watching military vehicles move through his town. A senior officer had just finished briefing him on the situation. The bikers weren't just deserters. They were part of a larger espionage operation. Their presence in the small town hadn't been random. They'd been hiding in plain sight, using their reputation as troublemakers to deflect suspicion. By late afternoon, Thomas finally returned to the diner. The military presence had thinned out, though 2 MPs remained stationed outside. Inside, Sarah had reopened for business, and regular customers trickled in, eager for news. As Thomas took his usual seat at the counter, Sarah placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. From under the counter, she pulled out a small box. Inside were his scattered medals, carefully collected and polished by the diner's staff. The general asked us to return these to you, Mr. Henderson, she said softly. You mentioned something about a ceremony. Thomas nodded, touching the medals gently. Tomorrow at the VFW Hall, they're insisting on making a fuss. He looked up at Sarah with a twinkle in his eye. Though I suspect it's more about closing the case than honoring an old man's medals. As the sun set over the Montana hills, customers in the diner watched Thomas with new eyes. The quiet veteran who had endured weeks of harassment had turned out to be a masterful strategist, conducting one final operation that had protected not just his own dignity, but national security itself. The flip phone lay silent now on the counter beside him, its mission accomplished. Thomas Henderson, the 93-year-old veteran who had once again served his country, simply sipped his coffee and watched the evening shadows grow long across the diner's floor. The next morning, the VFW hall buzzed with activity unseen since the last Memorial Day parade. American flags lined the walkway, and a Marine Corps honor guard stood at attention near the entrance. Inside, chairs were arranged in neat rows, filled with local residents, veterans, and high-ranking military officials. Thomas sat in the front row, wearing a freshly pressed blue suit. His original medals, carefully restored by a military curator who had worked through the night, gleamed on his chest. Sarah, dressed in her Sunday best, sat beside him, still trying to process the events of the past 24 hours. General Roberts stood at the podium, his voice carrying across the hushed room. What many of you witnessed yesterday wasn't just the arrest of some troublemakers. He began. You saw the culmination of a carefully orchestrated counterintelligence operation, led by one of the finest officers I've ever known. The general went on to reveal details that made the audience gasp. Rex and his gang had been part of a larger network of operatives attempting to sell military secrets to foreign buyers. Their choice of Miller's diner as a harassment target hadn't been random. They'd suspected Thomas's true identity and had been testing his reactions, looking for weaknesses. But they made one critical mistake, the general continued, a smile playing at his lips. They assumed age had dulled his instincts. Instead, Thomas Henderson proved that some skills never fade. Sheriff Martinez, sitting in the back, nodded as classified photos were shown on a screen. They revealed the complex web of surveillance and counter-surveillance that had been happening right under everyone's noses. Every time the bikers had harassed Thomas, they'd unknowingly revealed more of their own operation. The ceremony shifted as Catherine Martinez took the podium. The medal incident, she explained, was actually the turning point we needed. It forced their hand, made them sloppy. Within hours of that confrontation, two of their members attempted to move sensitive materials across the border, walking right into our trap. Thomas sat quietly through the revelations, his face showing the same calm demeanor he'd maintained throughout the ordeal. But those who knew him well could see the slight smile when the full scope of his strategy was revealed. FBI agent Cooper approached the podium next, holding up an evidence bag containing a laptop. Inside this computer, we found communications that led us to 3 other cells operating across the country. Mr. Henderson's patience and planning didn't just stop one group of criminals. It helped us unravel an entire espionage network. The audience murmured in amazement as more details emerged. The bikers' harassment, which had seemed like simple bullying, had been cover for their regular meetings with foreign contacts. Their loud motorcycles had been used to mask conversations from surveillance equipment. Even their choice of Miller's Diner had been strategic. Its location offered clear views of all approaching vehicles. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she realized how Thomas had used their own tactics against them. Every morning he'd sat at the counter, appearing vulnerable while actually observing their operations. His flip phone, which they'd mocked as outdated, had been a secure line to military command. The ceremony reached its climax as General Roberts called Thomas to the podium. The old veteran rose slowly, his posture straight and proud. The audience stood as one, applauding as he made his way forward. "Thomas Henderson," the general announced formally, "for your continued service to your country, for your extraordinary patience and tactical brilliance, and for your role in protecting national security, I am honored to present you with this commendation." As the general pinned a new medal to Thomas's chest, the old veteran finally spoke. His voice, clear and strong, carried to every corner of the hall. "I accepted their harassment not because I was weak," he said, "but because sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to let them think they're winning." The applause was thunderous. Local veterans who had watched Thomas endure weeks of bullying now understood the quiet strength they'd witnessed. Young service members present for the ceremony learned a powerful lesson about patience, strategy, and the different forms courage can take. As the ceremony concluded, Thomas returned to his seat. Sarah noticed his hand brush against the new medal, then touched the restored ones beneath it. In that gesture, she saw the connection between the young intelligence officer he'd been and the wise veteran he'd become. The crowd began to disperse, but Thomas remained seated, looking at the empty podium. His mission was complete, but its impact would ripple through the military community for years to come, a reminder that true strength often wears the quietest disguise. In the weeks following the dramatic arrests and ceremony, Miller's Diner underwent a remarkable transformation. What had once been a quiet local breakfast spot became a gathering place for veterans from across the state. Every morning, the small parking lot filled with cars bearing license plates from Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and beyond. Thomas maintained his usual routine, arriving at 7:15 a.m. sharp, but now his corner booth had been officially reserved with a small brass plaque reading, "Reserved, T. Henderson, World War II veteran and American hero." More importantly, the booth had been expanded to accommodate the steady stream of visitors who came to share coffee with him. Sarah noticed how he handled his newfound celebrity with the same quiet grace he'd shown during the harassment. Each morning, different veterans would join him, young and old, sharing stories and seeking advice. Thomas listened more than he spoke, but when he did share his experiences, the diner would fall into a respectful silence. One rainy morning, a young Army surgeon named Michael Torres visited the diner. He'd been struggling with PTSD from his recent deployment, and word had spread about the wise veteran at Miller's Diner. Thomas spent 3 hours with him, their coffee growing cold as they talked in low voices. "You know what the hardest part is?" Sarah overheard Michael saying, his hands trembling slightly. "Nobody understands what it's like to carry these memories." Thomas's response was gentle but firm. "The memories don't have to be a burden, son. They can be a tool, just like any other skill you learned in service. It's all in how you use them." The impact of Thomas's words spread beyond the diner's walls. Local schools began asking him to speak to students about history, not just of wars, but of the quiet heroism that happens behind the scenes. He always ended these talks with the same message: True strength isn't about showing power, it's about knowing when and how to use it. The diner's walls, once decorated with generic landscapes, now displayed photographs and memorabilia donated by visiting veterans. Each item told a story, creating a living museum of service and sacrifice. Sarah had to hire 2 new waitresses to handle the increased customer flow, and she made sure each one understood the special nature of their workplace. One significant change came when a group of veteran bikers, real ones, belonging to a respected military motorcycle club, arrived one morning. They presented Thomas with a leather vest bearing special patches, signifying his status as an honorary member. The sight of legitimate bikers showing such respect helped heal the town's recent wounds. The local VFW hall experienced a revival as well. Young veterans who had previously felt disconnected from the older generation started attending meetings regularly. Thomas worked with them to establish a mentoring program, pairing experienced veterans with those newly returned from service. Perhaps the most touching development came from an unexpected source. Jake, one of the arrested gang members, wrote a letter to Thomas from military prison. In it, he expressed deep remorse and explained how the quiet dignity Thomas had shown in the face of harassment had forced him to confront his own failures as a soldier. Sarah kept the diner's guest book filled with signatures and messages from visitors. Some were simple thanks, others were long stories of how Thomas's example had influenced their lives. One entry, written by a retired CIA officer, simply read, "You haven't changed a bit since Berlin, old friend. Still teaching lessons without saying a word." The media eventually caught wind of the story, but Thomas declined most interviews. He did, however, agree to speak with a military historian who was documenting intelligence operations from the Cold War era. Their conversations, conducted over several weeks at his corner booth, would later become part of a classified training manual for new intelligence officers. 1 year after the incidents, Miller's Diner hosted a special celebration for Thomas's 94th birthday. Veterans from across the country attended, along with military officials and intelligence officers whose names would never be publicly known. The small diner could barely contain the crowd. During the celebration, Sarah presented Thomas with a coffee mug specially made for him. On it was inscribed a quote from his testimony at the ceremony: "Patience is not weakness, and wisdom is not surrender." As Thomas held the mug, looking at the packed diner filled with people whose lives he touched, his eyes grew misty. The quiet veteran who had endured weeks of harassment had become a beacon of hope and wisdom for a new generation of service members. The diner, once a battleground, had transformed into a place of healing, understanding, and connection. And at its heart sat Thomas Henderson, sipping his coffee from his new mug, ready to listen to whoever needed to share their story next. 5 years after the biker incident, Miller's Diner had become a landmark that appeared on military veterans' maps across the country. Thomas Henderson, now 98, still visited every morning, though he needed a walker and was accompanied by Mark, a former Marine who had become like a grandson to him. The diner's legacy had grown far beyond its small-town origins. What started as a simple mentoring program had evolved into the Henderson Veterans Support Network, a nationwide organization helping veterans transition to civilian life. The program had a special focus on intelligence officers returning from covert operations, offering them a safe space to decompress and share experiences with those who understood. Sarah, her hair now streaked with gray, had expanded the diner to twice its original size. The new section, called the Intelligence Wing in honor of Thomas's service, featured private booths where veterans could talk quietly. Each booth was equipped with sound-dampening technology donated by a grateful military contractor. On this particular morning, Thomas sat in his usual spot, watching a young woman in civilian clothes enter the diner. He recognized the way she scanned the room. The habits of intelligence work never quite fade. She was Amy Chen, recently returned from an operation she couldn't discuss, seeking the wisdom of the legendary veteran she'd heard about during her training. "Mr. Henderson," she said, approaching his booth, "they still use your Berlin operation as a case study at the farm. I never thought I'd get to meet you in person." Thomas gestured for her to sit. Sarah appeared automatically with fresh coffee, having learned over the years that these conversations required regular refills and absolute discretion. "Tell me, young lady," Thomas said, his voice softer now but still carrying that note of quiet authority, "what brings you to an old man's breakfast table?" As Amy shared her struggles with returning to normal life after years of undercover work, Thomas listened with the same patience he'd shown during the biker incident years ago. His method of dealing with that situation had become required reading at intelligence training facilities, a perfect example of how patience and strategic thinking could overcome brute force. The diner's walls now held more than just military memories. There were photographs of wedding ceremonies held in the parking lot, baby announcements from veterans who'd found hope in the diner's community, and memorial plaques for those who had passed on. Each told a story of healing and connection. Rex, the former biker leader, had completed his prison sentence and, surprisingly, reached out to Thomas again. After much consideration, Thomas had agreed to meet him. That meeting led to Rex becoming one of the program's success stories. He now worked with veterans struggling with PTSD, using his own experience as a cautionary tale and path to redemption. The original brass plaque on Thomas's booth had been joined by a small collection of international medals, awarded by grateful nations whose secrets he'd helped protect during his career. Most visitors didn't know their significance, but occasionally a foreign dignitary would visit, recognize the medals, and bow respectfully to the elderly veteran. As the morning sun filled the diner, Thomas shared with Amy the same wisdom he'd been sharing for years. Our greatest strength often lies in our patience, not our power. Sometimes, the best victory is the one where nobody knows you've won. The Henderson Veterans Support Network had grown to include 50 diners across the country, each modeled after Miller's. They'd all served the same menu, had the same sound-dampened booths, and fostered the same spirit of community that Thomas had built. Each location had a direct line to veteran support services and intelligence community resources. Thomas's story had become legend in military circles, taught alongside tactical operations and strategic planning. But it wasn't the dramatic arrest of the bikers that instructors focused on. It was the weeks of patient observation, the strategic thinking, and the wisdom of allowing events to unfold at their own pace. As Amy left the diner that morning, visibly more at peace than when she arrived, Thomas watched her go with satisfaction. Sarah brought him a fresh cup of coffee, and they shared a knowing look. The diner that had once been a battleground had become a sanctuary, a place where the wounds of service could heal and the wisdom of experience could be passed on. Thomas Henderson's legacy lived on not just in military records or intelligence manuals, but in the countless lives he'd touched, the veterans he'd helped, and the community he'd built. The quiet veteran who had turned harassment into hope had shown that sometimes the greatest victories come not from confrontation, but from the patient wisdom of knowing when to wait, when to act, and how to transform enemies into allies.